Welcome to the Spectre of Communism podcast.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communist.
The communist. The communist.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
You might not have heard of the name Ted Grant, but he was the most important Marxist theorist since the death of Leon Trotsky. He was a lifelong revolutionary, and I'm very fortunate to be speaking with his longtime friend and collaborator, Alan Woods, who is the main leader and theoretician of the Revolutionary Communist International. Alan, thanks so much for being on the show once again.
My pleasure, as always.
So, who exactly was Ted Grant, and how did you come to know him?
Who was Ted Grant? Interesting question, which doesn't admit of a quick, easy answer. Well, first of all, he was a very remarkable man. He was remarkable for political reasons, which you explained. Also, personally, he was a very humane person. But above all, he impressed people with his profound grasp of Marxism, of every aspect of Marxist theory and ideas. And his unique talent, I think it was unique, is that he was able, as nobody else that I've ever met, and I've met a few people that were competent Marxists, you could say, but nevertheless, he could put across the most complex and difficult ideas in the most simple and easily understood language, so that he was quite happy speaking to anybody. He'd speak to people on the bus that he met, people who were completely non-political. He would engage them in political discussions, and they would listen to him and answer and so on. Or to university professors, very often he, like myself, he didn't have a very high opinion of them, but I mean, he could talk to them, and not on equal terms, because he was far superior to them intellectually, as you could expect. But yes, he was a remarkable man, and therefore, as far as I personally am concerned, well, personally speaking, of course, he was a very close friend of mine, very close friend, all my life, and was a formative and decisive influence on the whole of my adult life, starting from a very young age, as a matter of fact. And therefore, I am profoundly grateful for Ted Grant, and always will be, as I think everybody else that ever met Ted would agree with me, that he made a profound impression on people. People that knew Ted didn't forget him at all. That goes for enemies as much as friends. But he made a few enemies, naturally, as any serious revolutionary must. But that was also to his credit. He stuck to his guns. He always defended a firm position. He was prepared to defend it against anybody. And he did so doggedly all his life. And for that also, I regard him with great respect.
It's notable that when Ted passed away in 2006, even some of the bourgeois press had to give respectful words directed towards him in obituaries and so on, recognising his life's work.
Well, that's right. How could they not, after all? Ted was the man responsible, actually. He founded the organisation, the tendency to which I've always belonged, by the way, since I was 16 years of age. I've never changed in that respect. He founded this organisation, which later on became known as the militant tendency, which, following Ted's ideas, it was Ted's ideas, nobody else. Don't be fooled by what anyone else might say about this. He was the unique founder and originator of the militant tendency, which is based on his ideas, not just in the theoretical field, in which he was beyond parallel, but also in the tactical and strategic field. He was a master of revolutionary tactics. And above all, the work which we carried out at that time in the labour movement in Britain was beyond parallel. It was a model work which we conducted, starting with a very low basis. When I joined the organisation in 1960, I think we were about 30 members in the whole world, in the whole of Britain. I say the whole of Britain. We had a small group in South Wales, which I was fortunate enough to come into contact with in Swansea in 1960. We had nothing in Scotland, nothing in Ireland, of course. And a very small organisation, no full-timers, no officers. And yet, this tiny group, it was minuscule. Any group was bigger than us at that time. It managed to grow under Ted's direct control and influence and direction into the most successful Trotskyist organisation, I would say, in the world, particularly for its work in the labour movement, which we can discuss later on. But I mean, here was a man that we got to the stage, we'll discuss this later, but everybody in Britain knew about the militant terrorism. Mm-hmm. That's why the press had to cover his death as well, because he was a measurable, I won't say decisive, that would be an exaggeration, but certainly a significant measurable influence on British politics in general. Don't worry about that. Mm-hmm. And therefore they recognised, I think even most of his enemies grudgingly accepted that Ted was a very significant person and a leading element, a leading light on the left. The very small number that had a spiteful attitude to Ted, well, I feel sorry for them, I can't be bothered with those people. Most people didn't have that attitude, because apart from anything else, he never was personal or poisonous or vengeful in his attitude, even to enemies. He'd be loyal even to enemies in that. You never hear a spiteful word. Sometimes he'd joke about it. He had a very wicked sense of humour. That's permissible. But spitefulness and so, that was entirely alien to Ted's nature. And therefore, everyone even respected him, shall we say, also as a human being. Mm. And that's reflected in the editorials, which you've correctly mentioned.
Well, we're going to be talking about some of Ted's life and works, his writings, the very impressive predictions he made, particularly in the immediate aftermath of World War II. But I should say, before we go on, that Well-Read Books, the bookstore of the Revolutionary Communist International, is going to be releasing the long-awaited third volume of Ted's collected writings, which will be released in January 2026. I'll put a link in the description where you can pre-order your copy so you can read some of Ted's best work yourself. But let's wind the clock back slightly to Ted's early political activity, because he came into political activity quite early in life, is my understanding.
Oh, yes, when he was still very young, when he was still virtually a child, he started to take an interest. Now, here's an interesting point. Most people didn't realise that Ted Grant actually was born in South Africa. And he was South African, and he always considered himself to be South African.
Born Isaac Blank originally, yes?
That's right, yes, Isaac Blank, because he was from a Jewish family from the Russian Empire. Lithuania was part of the Russian Empire. And of course the Jewish population there suffered terrible persecution at the hands of the Tsarist regime. And they had to leave Lithuania, they had to go abroad. And they ended up in South Africa, where they made quite a success for themselves. I think they were successful. I think they had maybe a small business or a farm, I can't remember exactly. But the father, about which I don't know a great deal about his father, but he must have been a hell of a character, you know. They built a successful business and so on, but there was a problem with his dad. He was addicted to gambling. And again, most people, even in the movement, didn't realise Ted Grant was also a gambler. Some people might say he gambled with perspectives, but that's just a matter of opinion. But he didn't spend huge amounts of money. He didn't have huge amounts of money to spend. But it was certainly on a Saturday. His favourite hobby was to put a couple of bob on the horses and so on. But his father, that was different. His father was really addicted to gambling, and this eventually got him into serious difficulties. The family was in terrible economic straits as a result of that. And therefore the marriage entered into crisis. I don't know the details, but eventually the father left. So that from a very young age, in his childhood, Ted was left, not an orphan, he was left with his mother, who he loved dearly, deeply loved his mother. But his father just went out of his life, as far as I know. But as a child, you see, Ted lived in South Africa. He always had fond thoughts about that. He always had a slight South African accent. Most people couldn't notice it, but I noticed it. He had a slight South African accent. By the way, he could even sing the Zulu. I think it's a Zulu version of the Red Flag, and also the famous song of the South African, the ANC song. Actually, I think it became the national anthem. Sosu Sikalere Africa. He had a terrible voice, by the way, but nevertheless he knew the words. He was quite proud of being South African. He had happy memories of his childhood in this wonderful sunlit land and so with fruit. And yes, but even then, you see, even as a child, Ted was very conscious of the fact of the terrible oppression suffered by the blacks in South Africa. The terrible treatment, the racism, the treatment by the whites, and so he was. And that had a tremendous effect on him, you know. Ted Grant, I think it was in his genetic makeup, I think. Something deep in his character. He had a deep-seated aversion to any kind of oppression or discrimination or inequality or injustice. He had a profound hatred of injustice. I think Lenin was the same. Marx, I think, also. But Ted certainly had this deep, profound sense of injustice. And even as quite a young adolescent, he therefore gravitated, when he became conscious of politics, if you like, he gravitated towards communism. And at that time, of course, that meant the Communist Party. There was a Communist Party in South Africa. It wasn't a very big party, but it had quite a significant presence. And therefore he joined the Communist Party. I don't know how old he would be, 15, 16, I don't know. Maybe younger. But in any case, of course he joined that party at a time when the party was beginning to enter into crisis. And the reason for that crisis, of course, was not in South Africa, it was in Russia, in the Soviet Union. The struggle, the split between Stalin and Trotsky was developing, and this was reflected internationally. In America, for example, there was a split led by Cannon and others, who left the Communist Party and set up another organization. And Trotsky was at that time in the process of setting up the international left opposition. I think it was by accident that somebody that Ted knew went into a communist bookshop in South Africa, and found, I think, the journal of the American Trotskyists. And he read it, and he read other things as well. And they became the first small Trotskyist group, of which Ted belonged to. And they commenced revolutionary work then in South Africa, under very, very difficult conditions in South Africa.
Eventually, Ted travelled to Britain.
Yes.
Via France, where I think he ran into Trotsky's son, if I'm not wrong.
He did.
Leon Sedov. But why did Ted move to Britain?
Well, it became clear to them, to the members of this small group, and it became clear to Ted eventually, that to do successful revolutionary work in South Africa was very difficult, almost impossible. They did participate in strikes of the blacks and so on.
The Laundry Workers' Union, I think.
Yes, exactly. They played a role in that. But in general, it was very tough going. And at that time, Europe was in a state of crisis. You had the rise of fascism in Germany and Spain and Italy and so on. And even the question of war was gradually becoming more and more of a possibility. And they recognized that the only possibility would be to move to Britain, actually, which, of course, at that time, South Africa was part of the empire, as it then was. And it was a natural step to take, since they spoke English and so on. So he did that. Yes, he tells some interesting stories about their sea journey. I dealt with all these questions in a book which I wrote called The Permanent Revolutionary, which your listeners might be interested in.
Yeah, I'll put a link to where you can buy that in the description as well.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, Ted went to Paris, as you correctly said. He met Leon Sedov, Trotsky's son, who was in charge of the international left opposition internationally, from Paris. Trotsky was, I think, in Norway at that time, or in France, one or the other. Anyway, he had a very, very favourable impression of Leon Sedov. He also met another guy called Etienne, that wasn't his real name, who turned out to be a GPU agent that later was responsible for organising the assassination of Leon Sedov. And Ted had he said he had very bad feelings about this guy, didn't like this chap at all. But anyway, that's another story. He ended up in London, where they began to set up a small group, a small Trotskyist group based in London, in Paddington, I believe. But anyway, they began to organise. There were other Trotskyist groups around at that time, which they looked at, but frankly, they were most unimpressed by these groups. They mainly consisted of bohemian elements, as Ted would say, Ted always said they used to walk around with cloaks and sandals, open-toed sandals, like, well, bohemians, you know.
That look a little bit strange, even on the streets of London today, I think.
Well, imagine what it was like in 1936, 37, whatever it was. Anyway, so they really speaking, had to go their own way. Although later on, of course, Cannon turned up in London and tried to force through a unity, but that's another question.
So this is James P. Cannon,
Yes.
the sort of leader of the American SWP, right?
That's right.
So that's the main Trotskyist group in America at this time.
Well, not only in America, I mean, at that time, the SWP was the leading, the biggest and the most influential Trotskyist group in the world, actually, outside of the left opposition in Russia, which, as you can imagine, was in a very difficult position. And therefore, they had enormous authority. Cannon also had enormous authority. Cannon, in fairness to Cannon, to be honest with you, Joe, the so-called leaders of the Fourth International were useless, frankly. They're useless, but as we'll see, no doubt later on in this discussion. But of all of them, Ted said, well, Cannon was probably the best or the least bad. At least, in as much as at least he was a man with a history in the movement and a history in the workers' movement. You know, that's yes, but Cannon had a problem. You know, he never was a theoretician. That's common to all these people. He never was a theoretician. There was nothing profound about James P. Cannon. He was an agitator. He was proud of the fact, actually. I think at one time he boasted, well, nobody will ever call me a theoretician. He was boasted about it. Yeah, practical, agitated, which is a fatal thing. Like Zinoviev. You know. He was a follower of Zinoviev, actually. That's the fact of the matter. Cannon, he always remained a Zinovievite at heart, I think. Anyway, so Cannon turned up in London with the intention of pushing through a fusion of there were different Trotskyist groups. There's one in Scotland, and there's several groups. But they were pursuing different tactics. There was a big argument as to whether they should or should not join the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, which split from the Labour Party, I think in 1932, on a left-wing basis, which there was possibilities there. Trotsky thought they ought to enter the ILP, but they couldn't agree on anything, actually. And therefore, the so-called Unity Conference was a farce. But Cannon, you see, with his Zinovievite methods, he wanted to force through unity at all costs. Never mind about the principled agreement. You just all in together, never mind the weather kind of thing.
Can I just expand for people who don't know? Zinoviev was an important figure in the Russian Revolution, played quite a negative role from Russia in terms of the relations between the Comintern and its different sections. So you say that Cannon was a Zinovievite. What is that? What is a Zinovievite?
Well, basically, what I mean by that is that he, instead of basing himself on ideas and principles, which Lenin and Trotsky always did, he relied heavily on intrigues and maneuvers in order to get his way and to get charge of things, which is a fatal disease. It's a bureaucratic method, actually. And he tried this in Britain, but it didn't work with Ted and co. Ted and his followers said, no. Thanks, but no thanks. We're not having this. And they predicted, they said, look, we're in favour of unity, we're in favour of the Fourth International, but you try this, you try fusing people without a principled agreement on what tactical line we're following, it'll be a disaster. They said you'll fuse 2 groups into 10, which is precisely what happened. You know, later on, these groups, they agreed to the fusion, then they split into pieces naturally. And our group then began to develop quite seriously. The Workers' International League. And that became a very strong organisation, particularly during the war, during the Second World War, which broke out, as you know, in 1939. But that's again another story.
And we actually dealt with the Second World War at some length in another podcast, to which this is almost something of a sequel. Alan debunked some common bourgeois myths about World War II. I'll link that episode also in the description, so you can catch yourself up. But can we talk a bit more about the activities of Ted's group during the war, for those who haven't watched that episode, perhaps?
Well, of course, the war caused tremendous confusion and chaos in the labour movement generally. But Trotsky put forward, shortly before he was assassinated in August 1940, he'd put forward...
Proletarian military policy.
Yes, it was a development of Lenin's idea of revolutionary defeatism, but adapted to the new conditions that existed at that time. Mm-hmm. And Trotsky had the position that, for example, the Trotsky should not, with his conscription, you don't go against them, you join the go with the rest of the class and conduct revolutionary work inside the forces. But the main program would be, no unity with the bourgeois for an independent class policy, irrespective of the war. In other words, we don't have one policy for peace and another totally different policy for war. That's not our position at all. And that was the correct line, which the British communists followed. The will immediately accepted that and carried out to some extent, with some success. The others did not. They adopted, in effect, a pacifist position, a stupid position, and they fell to bits as a result.
Mm-hmm. And eventually, Cannon reapproached Ted and his group when it was evident that the will was the stronger of the Trotskyist organizations in Britain, and there was eventually a unity, but my understanding it was one where essentially Ted's group took over the so-called official section. Well, I mean,
it wasn't the strongest of it was the only viable Trotskyist group in Britain, actually. The others were in such a mess, they were on the point of collapse at that stage. But in any case, yes, so Cannon had no alternative to swallow his pride. He didn't like it. Mm. He didn't like the will because they stood against him, you see.
Never really forgave them for that, I feel.
They never forgave the British, no. But never forgave Ted. But in any case, they accepted that the will was the official section and pushed the others to join the will, which they did. And as a result of that, you had the creation of, in 1944, March 1944, I think, something like that, of the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, a name which we've adopted since, because we the inheritors of this movement, And that was quite a successful movement during the war, Had a number of successes. They even had a strike of apprentices in Newcastle, which was, strikes were supposed to be illegal during the war. But they played a good role. And in the armed forces, the communists intervened, and with some success among the troops, among the soldiers at the front. For example, we had a comrade in Swansea. Not a comrade. I knew a man in Swansea called Frank Field. Beg your pardon, Frank Ward. Frank
Field comes a bit later, I believe.
He's a right-wing Labour. Frank Ward, I beg your pardon. Mm. Frank Ward, and he'd been in the RAF, the Air Force, during the war. He conducted revolutionary propaganda. They tried by all means to get rid of him. They couldn't get rid of him because he loyally carried out all his responsibilities, his military. He didn't break discipline, anything like that. They couldn't get rid of him. And finally, they had to give him an honor. They only got rid of him by giving him an honourable discharge. Mm. And he spent the rest of the war struggling to get back in again, But as he said to me, at that time, he said, I could have won over the whole of my squadron to Trotskyism. Anyway, they did score considerable success. But of course, that was during the war. After the war, the conditions changed again.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the end of the war, because, as you say, Trotsky was assassinated in 1940. Trotsky, at the founding Congress in 1938, had a certain perspective for how he saw perspectives developing in the coming period. The aftermath of the war didn't match those perspectives. In what way were they different to what Trotsky had predicted?
Well, they were completely different. But you see, what one has to understand is that perspectives, there's nothing magic about perspectives. A perspective is a conditional hypothesis, a working hypothesis, that's all. Any perspective is conditional. And whether or not that's proven to be correct, you have to follow events to see that. Now, if Trotsky had lived, I haven't got the slightest doubt, because events during the war developed differently to what he'd anticipated. For example, he didn't think that the Soviet Union under Stalin it had degenerated so far, he wasn't sure that they could have resisted, they could have survived the war. They did, not only that, in spite of Stalin. It wasn't because of Stalin, that's nonsense what they say now, but I think I dealt with that in the previous talk. In spite of Stalin, in spite of everything, the Soviet workers rallied to the revolution, actually, rallied to the October Revolution, and therefore they fought like tigers, and they defeated Hitler's Germany. And they staged the biggest advance in history until they reached Berlin. And the Allies had to scramble then to launch D-Day in order to try to get to Berlin before the Russians, which they failed to do. The Russians beat the Germans in the second. The Soviet Union defeated the Germans on its own. Now this meant several things. First of all, it meant an enormous increase in the authority of Stalinism. It wasn't in crisis as Trotsky anticipated. And that also meant there were revolutionary movements in Europe which Trotsky had anticipated, but of course they were led by the reformists and Stalinists. And that, of course, doomed them to defeat.
Mm.
So that revolutionary wave was defeated. Now, Trotsky originally had thought that capitalism would be in crisis, as happened after the First World War. He was drawing that analogy. Now, that was wrong. In other words, Trotsky's initial hypothesis was falsified by events, was falsified by history. And if he would have been alive, I have not the slightest doubt that he would have changed that perspective. Of course. It doesn't fit the situation, you change it. However, these pygmies which had taken over after Trotsky's death, the Cannons and the Franks and the Maitans and the Mandels and Pablo and those people, they couldn't see further than the end of their own nose. And they repeated like parrots what Trotsky had written in 1938, when that had nothing whatsoever to do with the changed situation. And the only person in the International that understood this and corrected it, moved in the correct direction, was Ted Grant, which shows his colossal superiority. But he couldn't convince these idiots that they had to change their position. They persisted, and therefore they made every possible mistake that one could imagine.
So, I want to draw attention to a remarkable article that Ted wrote in March of 1945, where he explains how, and really quite precisely how, the situation after the war is going to be different to what Trotsky predicted and different to the perspective that the leaders of the Fourth International are mechanically repeating. It's called the changed relationship of forces in Europe and the role of the Fourth International. And I'm not going to read big passages of this article out because you should read the article, but I will say that it contains so many perspectives that were completely correct. He talks about how capitalism and Stalinism are going to play this role that you described of holding back the workers' movement. He talks about the perspective for the aftermath of World War II not being one of crisis and collapse for capitalism, but actually a significant economic recovery. He talks about how the Soviet Union is going to be able to recover from the impact of the war. And there's a passage where he describes a really important concept, which is the counter-revolution in democratic form. Would you mind explaining that a little bit?
Well, you see, as I said, the leaders of the Fourth got everything wrong. They talked about an immediate slump, whereas in reality, you see, the question is the situation was different at the end of the First World War. Now, America and Russia emerged as the two decisive powers in the world. On the one hand, mighty imperialist America. On the other hand, mighty Stalinist Russia. They confronted each other. And the Americans were worried at this stage about the threat of communism in Europe, the threat of a revolution, in effect, which was real enough, if it wasn't for the conduct of the Stalinists in particular, and also the reformists. And therefore, they actually prevented an economic collapse by rushing aid to Europe in the Marshall Aid Plan. You must have heard of that. Vast sums of money, because the main point is that America emerged from that war intact. They were never bombed, as Germany and Italy and Britain were bombed. America was never bombed. Its industries were all intact. And in 1945, 2/3 of all the gold available in the world was in Fort Knox, was in American hands. Mm-hmm. And therefore they were in a position at that time to underwrite the economic crisis. They flooded Europe with dollars, and ensured that it did not collapse. And that, of course, meant a boom, an economic recovery, more than a boom, at the beginning of a colossal upswing. And of course, that also strengthened reformism for a whole period. So here you have a strengthening of reformism and a strengthening of Stalinism. Now, the other position, the leaders of the Fourth were so stupid. They said, no, that's not going to happen. The real perspective is slump, wars, fascism. Actually, the Americans actually said that the war had not finished. And they maintained that position right up until the 1950s, I believe. That the Second World War was going on all the time, if you can imagine that. And the other corollary was fascism, immediate fascism, Bonapartism, strong state, reaction everywhere. And Ted said no. Mm-hmm. That is not the perspective. The perspective is because they've managed to stabilize the situation. Now, what you'll have now, you will have counter-revolution, but not in the form of fascism and Bonapartism. That's wrong. It'll be in a democratic form, the form of bourgeois democracies, which is exactly what occurred.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to read a short passage from this article. It's amazing. It always gives me chills when I read this piece, actually. He writes, American imperialism, with its huge resources and productive capacity, is driven to attempt the organization of the entire world in an endeavour to escape the consequences of the insoluble contradictions between the capacities and limitations of even the great American market. Taking advantage of the chaos and disorganisation of Europe caused by the war, American finance capital hopes to put Europe on rations by means of loans and the weapon of food, supplies and equipment, while simultaneously, at moments of stress and turmoil, blackmailing and buying off the revolutions by the same means. Mm-hmm. And he goes on to say, it is possible, on the basis of the support rendered to world imperialism by Stalinism and classical reformism, that world imperialism can succeed for a period in stabilising bourgeois democratic regimes in certain countries. The shocks of the war and debacle of fascism leave no mass basis for reaction in the immediate period ahead. I mean, that's pretty much blow for blow exactly what happened.
Yes, that's right. Well, there's no need to add anything to that, is there?
No, that's pretty comprehensive.
Yes, but Ted put that way forward, but the leaders of the International opposed that, rejected it entirely, and continued to insist on their madness of fascism, world war, slumps, Bonapartism, and the rest.
I have a quote actually to prove that from Ernst Mandel, who was one of the leaders of the Fourth International.
One of the worst.
One of the worst. He says, it is necessary to abandon right now any juggling with a boom that has not existed and that British capitalism will never experience again. Yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of quotes where they say similar things.
And he's supposed to be a great economist.
Yeah. Did in fact British capitalism experience a boom after 1947, when this was written?
Well, they went through some difficulties as a result of the destruction of the war. There was a difficult patch, but nevertheless, no, there was nothing like that. There wasn't a slump, no. And it was a recovery, yes.
Yeah. So, can I ask, it feels, I mean, it's true that these people were second rate, as you've been saying, but it feels unsatisfactory to just reduce their failures to personal characteristics. Why is it that these people couldn't see this and Ted could? What was the deciding factor?
Well, you know, Ted used to say to me, he said, look, in war, there are many parallels between the class struggle and war, of course. The importance of good generals is fundamental. When the army is advancing, good generals are very important. But if the army reaches a difficult point and has to retreat, has to withdraw, then the importance of leadership is absolutely decisive. Because with good generals, you can retreat in good order and then prepare for an advance when conditions change. With bad generals, you turn a retreat into a rout. And that's what happened. Why didn't they understand? Well, you tell me. Because they had no understanding whatsoever of Marxist theory, no understanding of Trotsky's method. They repeated his words like a parrot, repeating gibberish, which they didn't understand. They never understood the method of Trotsky. That's the superior, all the time, all his life, the great supreme superiority of Ted Grant is his colossal, profound grasp of this marvelous thing called Marxist theory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why don't other people possess that? Well, you tell me. Perhaps they're mentally lazy, but I don't know. Perhaps they're just simply bad leaders and bad Marxists. That's more like it. Think that they're clever and they're not. There's too many people around like that, Joe. Too many, even to this day.
Isn't that the truth? All right, so you have this difference of perspective. The British RCP, the British section of the Fourth International, brings Ted's point of view to these debates with the leaders of the International. How do Cannon and co. respond? Is there a democratic exchange of views? Do they take on board any of Ted's positions? What is their response to Ted's objections?
Well, they responded as they always respond, by manoeuvres and intrigues. Zinovieite methods. In the case of Britain, they found a stooge, they found an agent. They could never get a majority in the RCP. Never. At any time. But they got a stooge called Jerry Healy, a really pernicious character.
Yeah, very unsavoury guy.
I won't talk much about him, but there you are.
My auntie was in his group, actually.
Was he? Oh, well, poor woman.
Quite.
But he was their agent. It's quite comical now. They went Pablo this and Pablo like that. Look, Pablo was no bloody good, but Healy was the original British Pabloite. He was an unconditional supporter of Pablo and of the leadership of the International against the leaders of the RCP, against Ted in particular. Mm-hmm. And eventually, I won't go into all the unsavoury details, they engineered a split. Healy split away. And then finally that led to the disintegration of the RCP.
And Ted predicted also that the coming period would be a difficult one for the genuine revolutionaries, for the Trotskyists. Can we explain why that was? Why was the aftermath of the war such a lean period for revolutionaries?
Well, it's simple to answer that. You see, because of this enormous economic upswing, it wasn't just a boom, by the way. The post-war economic upswing, which lasted, I think, up until about 1973-74. That was the first recession since the Second World War, really. And that enabled capitalism to give certain reforms. Okay, take the Labour government in Britain. The Labour government was elected, and of course, the communists were predicting that Labour would it would not carry out its program. The reformers would not carry out their program. Now, in general, that's true. It always has been the case. It's the case now. Look at the Starmer government in Britain. They're not carrying out anything that they promised. However, the one exception in the whole of history was precisely the Labour government elected in 1945. But elected, by the way, in a massive majority. The workers came home, the soldiers came home from the war, and Churchill thought he was going to win. He thought he'd have an easy victory. He was booted out unceremoniously and replaced because the workers wanted a change. Actually, they wanted a revolution. That's the point. But the Labour government then carried out, because of the enormous economic boom and so on, they were able to carry out sweeping reforms. They nationalised coal, they nationalised steel, they nationalised other industries. They introduced the national health, which is far bigger and better at that time than what it is now. Now it's just reduced to a shambles, but then it was a great thing. Free medicine, the first time. These are huge increase, improvements in education, improvements in housing, a colossal housing program, and so on and so on. My own family benefited from that, the first council houses and so on. These were colossal developments. And therefore, the Labour leaders could turn to the workers and say, well, look, we are delivering. All right, times are hard. You've got austerity, you've got rationing. I remember rationing myself, going to the sweet shop with a ration book. I remember that. But no, but nevertheless, look what we're doing. And when the communists were going to go to members of the Labour Party and say, look, your leaders are traitors, they're going to be, they say, what are you talking about? Trouble with you people is you're impatient. Give them a chance. Look, they've done all this. If they're elected again, they'll do some more, and eventually you get socialism and so on. So, in other words, what I'm saying is the road to the Labour Party was closed to us. That avenue was closed. It was a very promising avenue before, now it was closed. And the Stalinists, the Communist Party, there was the other avenue where we were getting success, that also was closed by the enormous illusions in Stalinism. So, where are you going to build? There was no question of entrism at that time, by the way, but which was being plugged by the International foolishly. There's nothing to be gained by that at that particular time. But, you see, as Ted used to say the following to me, he said, now look, even if Marx, Engels, Lenin and Trotsky were all alive and in charge of the International, it would have made a measurable difference, yes, but it wouldn't have been a decisive difference because the objective conditions were unfavourable. Very unfavourable. And you had to get your head around that and adjust accordingly. It was only possible to make small gains under those circumstances. And the main thing was to keep the ideas alive, which Ted did, although his group was reduced to a very small handful. But nevertheless, he did keep the ideas alive, and that was decisive. Mm-hmm. That was decisive.
Well, we'll talk about how Ted and the small group around him rebuilt in the next period in a moment. But first, I want to deal with two other really impressive predictions he makes in this period. The first concerns the situation in Eastern Europe.
Yes.
So Ted had a perspective on how the Stalinists would behave with relation to these regimes that had formerly been occupied in Eastern Europe, that he also came into conflict with leaders of the Fourth International over. What did Ted predict was going to happen in Eastern Europe?
Well, actually, Ted based himself on Trotsky's writings shortly before the war broke out in relation to Poland. You know, Poland had been divided between Germany and the Soviet Union under the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And Trotsky pointed out, you see, it's true that Stalinism plays a counter-revolutionary role, that's perfectly true. But in the occupied area, you see, what the Stalinists did, what Stalin did, they expropriated the bourgeoisie. Well, in any case, the capitalists and landlords mainly fled. Mm-hmm. So they were left with the road was open. The Stalinists leaned on the workers to nationalize industry. Okay? And that was progressive. That was a step forward. However, they never allowed the workers to take power into their own hands. Now, Ted correctly ascertained that's exactly what they were going to do now in Eastern Europe. And that is precisely what they did. Mm-hmm. In Czechoslovakia, for example, I think it was 48, something like that. When the Americans tried to introduce the Marshall Plan into Eastern Europe, that would have meant that the Soviet, the control over that area would be seriously threatened. The bourgeois elements in the governments would be strengthened. And Stalin thought, well, we can't have that. So he engineered a series of coups. In Czechoslovakia, there was a coup. They got rid of the bourgeois elements. They even armed the working class. Do you know that? They issued arms to the workers and mobilized the mass meetings, mass colossal demonstrations in Prague of workers supporting the communists taking over the economy and so on. Now, expropriating the bourgeois. But of course, the working class was never allowed to take control, as they were. That's the fundamental difference with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, where the working class was in power. The working class in these countries was never in power. So what you had is revolution in a distorted way, in a Bonapartist way, as Ted said. It would be an example of what Trotsky called proletarian Bonapartism. Now, we use the same analogy later for China. Where a similar process took place, under different conditions, of course.
I wanted to rest particularly on Yugoslavia for a moment before we move to talking about China. First of all, Ted had the measure of Tito straight away. He talked about Stalin and Tito representing nothing other than the leaders of respective national bureaucracies. Mm-hmm. Not only that, he predicted their split before it happened.
Yeah.
So, what did Ted say about the relations between Stalin and Tito in a bit more detail, and also how was that different from how the so-called leaders of the Fourth International saw things?
Well, again, their position was disastrous. They had the position that Yugoslavia was capitalist, okay? And they had that position until quite late on. And Ted argued what I said, that Tito actually would take power, would take over industry, and you'd have a state modelled on the lines of Moscow, but not Lenin's Moscow, but Stalin's Moscow. And that's what occurred. The only thing is, of course, that, again, Tito would not allow the workers to take control. In other words, it would be another version of a Stalinist regime, but of a nationalist character. The reason being that Tito, whereas in other countries like Czechoslovakia, the Red Army moved in and they took over. In the case of Yugoslavia, Tito actually took power through his own forces, through the partisan movement, which he led. And that gave him an independent base, which Stalin didn't want. Stalin was determined to assert his control over Yugoslavia, and Tito was determined to resist it purely for nationalist reasons. Nothing progressive about it, of course. But you see, the people, the so-called leaders of the Fourth, jumped from one extreme to the other. From arguing the position that Yugoslavia was capitalist, they then turned around and said, oh no, it's a healthy worker state. Like Russia in 1970, which wasn't true, wasn't the case. And of course, Ted also explained that the contradictions between the bureaucracy in Belgrade and the bureaucracy in Moscow would inevitably lead to a split, which actually occurred. He said that in advance.
Well, another split that he predicted in advance was that between Stalin and Mao.
That's right.
But even before that, he predicted quite precisely the way that Mao at the head of the peasant army would behave once they defeated Chiang Kai-shek. First of all, he predicted that they would defeat Chiang Kai-shek.
Yeah.
Then he said that they would first of all attempt to form a coalition with the Chinese bourgeoisie, but would only find its shadow and would be forced to expropriate them. And again, set up a bureaucratic worker state model along the lines of the Soviet Union. There's a really excellent article, which we've cited before on the podcast, called Stalinist Land Program Wins the Peasants, and it was written in January 1949. So this is very early on. And I'll quote a little bit. He says that Stalinism makes a coalition with the capitalists under conditions where the back of the bourgeoisie has been broken in order to play off the bourgeoisie against the danger of an insurgent proletariat. So, balancing between the classes in Bonapartist fashion. Thus, the coalition, which the Stalinists are proposing in China, will not mean the victory or even the survival of the bourgeoisie. It will be used in order to gain a breathing space for the organisation of a Stalinist, Bonapartist state machine on the lines of Moscow. That's exactly what happened. That's pretty much exactly what happened.
It's not only what happened, but he said that at a time when Mao had an entirely different perspective.
Yeah, that idea hadn't come into Mao's head, let alone...
No, it didn't. Mao had a program at that stage of 100 years of capitalism in China. That was his program. And actually he was in favour of organising some kind of a coalition with the bourgeoisie. The only problem was that the bourgeoisie was counter-revolutionary. They weren't accepting anything like that. And they tried to put up, but they couldn't put up much of a fight because they were hopelessly defeated by the Stalinists, by the peasant army. And as Ted used to say, see, China's got a long history of peasant wars in which the peasantry would rise up, defeat the existing government, overthrow a dynasty, but then the leaders of the peasants would fuse with the Mandarin class, if you like, and form a new dynasty, and the whole cycle would be repeated time and again. And that was the line that what apparently was going to occur in China, but wasn't so, as Ted explained. Now, the position of the International again was hopeless. They clinged to this position. By the way, Trotsky originally thought that was going to happen. In his writings on China before the war, he thought that was the most probable outcome, that the leaders of the Red Army would fuse with the bourgeoisie. Didn't happen. Capitalism in China was so rotten, and the Chiang Kai-shek so useless, they couldn't. They couldn't do that. Now, here's a case in point. You know, Schachmann, who split from Trotsky just before the war, on the question of state capitalism. Max Schachmann, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And he had his own organization, and he had a congress about this time that you're referring to, and they discussed the Chinese question. And as Ted said, Schachmann had them rolling in the aisles with laughter. They were helpless with laughter. But he cracked a joke. He said, well, the thing is, Mao Zedong wants to capitulate to Chiang Kai-shek. Trouble is, he can't catch up with him. Chiang Kai-shek was running away. He ran to the island of Formosa, which is now Taiwan. You know. So, no, there's no question. And then, of course, once he was in power, that was Mao's original idea was capitalism, to have a capitalist development, a long period of capitalist development. However, once he took power and took one look at the situation, the bourgeoisie was just useless, corrupt, worthless for any purpose, and therefore he just eliminated them. As a man would kill a louse with 2 fingernails, just got rid of it. He leaned on the workers and peasants to eliminate the capitalists and just took control. But there again, there was no question of ever giving the workers any control. As a matter of fact, when the Red Army, the peasant army that is, entered the city, there's an interesting book by an American called Communist on the Eve of China on the Eve of Communist Takeover. And it gives the orders of the Red Army when they entered the city, and so the cities. Stay at your place of work, don't strike, don't demonstrate. Anyone that causes disorder will be shot, and they were shot. No. They weren't going to give power to the workers under any condition. And that's what occurred. The Stalinists took power, but not in the way of 1917, but in a Stalinist, in a Bonapartist manner. And from a Bonapartist revolution, you get a Bonapartist regime.
So, out of all of this, what is the balance sheet of the Fourth International?
Well, the balance sheet is negative, in as much as the attempt that Trotsky made at that time, which was a correct attempt to launch a new international, was wrecked by the complete failure of the so-called leaders at that time, which they never rectified. And the result of that failure, both politically and organisationally, has been a series of splits of all kinds, where nowadays, you want the Fourth International, you've got plenty to choose from. There's about 20, I think, on the last count. All of them useless. Not one of them stand really for the ideas of Trotsky. And today, we can honestly say, the only organisation in the world that really stands for the original ideas of Trotsky and the Fourth International is our own organisation, the Revolutionary Communist International. And we've decidedly broken with the so-called squabbling sects, miserable sects, who call themselves Trotskyists and have nothing to do with the ideas of Trotsky, nothing to do with any of them. And we forged our own way, and I must say with considerable success, because we have the ideas of Ted Grant. That's the point. Now, out of all my experience of many years, I've come to the following conclusion. If you have the correct ideas, the correct theories, and the correct methods, you can always rebuild an apparatus. Even if you lose an apparatus, I've lost several in the course of my life, and we're not worried about that. You can always rebuild an apparatus, but the reverse is not true. You can have the biggest and most powerful apparatus in the world. If you lack the necessary ideas and theory, you will be shipwrecked. by history. And that's what occurred. That's what occurred. It has been an abortion. Now, I won't say anything more about this because it's not worth discussing. I mean, leave the sex to squabble as much as they like. We're not interested on what they think, say, or do. We are the genuine Fourth International. We don't claim that name because it's been hopelessly discredited, unfortunately, because of these things. Anyway, that's a separate question which I prefer not to. We turned our backs from them. They expelled us, by the way, finally. They expelled us several times, but the last time I think was in 1966, wasn't it? Or thereabouts. Anyway, he said, Ted at that time, he said, if you expel us this time, we won't be back for a long time. That was forever. We want nothing to do with it. That break was the prior condition for our present success.
All right, well, you mentioned that with the right ideas, you can always rebuild an apparatus. So how did Ted rebuild?
Well, I mean, Ted, on the basis of Ted's correct ideas of theory, we actually did successful work inside the Labour Party, although it has to be said that the classical conditions which Trotsky laid down for entrism did not apply. They didn't exist, really speaking, at that time. However, eventually they did come into being at a later date, when the Labour Party swung sharply to the left. That was after the big slump, the first recession, actually, since the Second World War, 1973-74, which opened up a new revolutionary period in Europe. There was a big radicalization at that time. And
which Ted also predicted in 1960, I believe.
He did. Which the others didn't accept. I mean, I remember that Ernest Mandel, the last time, I don't want to think about that gentleman.
One last time.
One last time. Came to London and he gave a long speech for an hour. He spoke about everything. Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam and all kinds of things. And he finished speaking, and this must have been about in January 1968. One of our comrades was in the audience and asked, Comrade Mandel, you've spoken for 1 hour about all kinds of things. You haven't mentioned the French working class once. You know what his reply was? You can forget about the French working class for the next 20 years. They're bourgeoisified, they're reformist, and nothing is to be hoped from. Of course, about a few weeks later, you had the biggest revolutionary general strike in France in history. And these people were looking entirely the wrong way. Anyway, I don't want to discuss that any further. We, on the contrary, stuck to our guns, stuck to our position in Britain, and we began with a remarkable success. It began when we got the majority of the Labour Party Young Socialists. We won the majority of the Labour Party Young Socialists. And we didn't then split away as the Healyites had done in the past. We didn't do that. We then turned the wires outwards to recruit young workers and students and so on. And then also inwards into the Labour Party to do work in the unions and the Labour Party, which we did with enormous success because the conditions were ripe for that. There was a sharp turn to the left with Tony Benn and Eric Heffer and people of that sort. And of course, our ideas began to get a strong echo in the rank and file. We had councillors up and down the countries, and we got a large membership. We ended up with thousands of members. We even got 3 members of parliament, which is something the Communist Party never had in Britain. Three Terry Fields, what's his name, Dave Nellist, and Pat Wall was our comrade. And Dave Nellist also was our comrade. So we had 2 members of parliament in effect, and then Terry Fields was a left wing from Liverpool. So this was a colossal success. Of course, all that subsequently was wrecked by an ultra-left turn by part of the leaders. Again, I don't want to go into the leaders. The problem is, Ted once said, success is sometimes more dangerous than failure. Sometimes a success can go to people's heads. They get big ideas, This man, Peter Taft, and the gang that supported him in the leadership. Again, Peter Taft, I knew Peter very well. I've known him for years. But Peter had talent, undoubtedly. He was a capable organizer and an agitator and so on. But again, same as Cannon in the States, he was never a theoretician. He had no theoretical basis whatsoever. And therefore, the whole ultra-left turn that took place was a disaster. He got big ideas. They got big ideas. They thought we'd arrived and this was it and so on. It's true, by the way, that at that stage, I think I mentioned this earlier on, the militant tendency was known to everybody in Britain. Mm-hmm. Anyone knew, because we were always being attacked on the television.
Yeah,
That's
sort of a boogeyman for the British establishment.
Yeah, absolutely. So therefore we became a threat, and therefore the establishment organised against us, using Labour's right wing and so on and so forth, to organise a purge, which eventually succeeded. But they had a hell of a problem to get rid of us. Anyway, they were helped in this by the leadership, who had an ultra-left position. They thought they could do without the Labour Party. They were off into the wilderness, and they said it was a shortcut. And Ted said, yes, a shortcut over a cliff. Mm. And he was shown to be correct. Now again, I don't wish to dwell upon this, except to say that a marvellous opportunity was thrown away, again by irresponsible leaders who didn't know, frankly, what they were doing. That's a fact. Anyway, leave that to one side. But again, we were reduced again to a small handful at that time. People like myself, Anna, of course, my comrade and partner, Rob Sewell, who'd been with me all the time since he was at school, actually, in South Wales, who played a very important role. And we were a tiny handful. We'd lost the apparatus. We had nothing, in effect. And yet, within a measurable space, and again, following the correct ideas, which we learned from Ted Grant, we managed to rebuild. Until now, we got the position that we have. You know, that the Revolutionary Communist International has been established. We have firm ideas, clear ideas. That's decisive. We have a growing number of our support is growing everywhere, not just in Britain, but in America, in Canada, in Germany, everywhere you look. In South America, in Brazil also, in Mexico. We are in Pakistan, of course. We are developing a strong organization. Of course, it's early begins. We don't make the mistake of exaggerating our strength. That's a foolish thing to do. But at least we know now that we're working on the correct basis. And of course, now our target, if you like, our aim now, it's very modest. We're aiming for two things. The youth, that's the key. The young people, and of course, theory. That's what separates us from the rest, everyone else. Our serious attitude towards theory. But that's the key to our success. That's what we learned of Ted Grant, and that's, of course, a very important lesson.
Mm. Unfortunately, Ted isn't here to witness the success that we've had in the Revolutionary Communist International. As I mentioned at the beginning, he passed away in 2006 at a ripe old age, with over 7 decades of revolutionary activity behind him, an entire life dedicated to the emancipation of the working class and the oppressed. But there probably aren't many people around who knew Ted as well as you did, Alan, and who worked with him as closely. What's the real measure of Ted Grant?
That's a very big question. Well, I've tried to answer it as best I could in the book, The Permanent Revolutionary, but that book, of course, is only a slim volume. I could have written several volumes about memories of Ted Grant. Perhaps I will do so at some stage. But he was a very interesting character. Character is the word, by the way. I said earlier on that he had a very good sense of humour. That's true. I remember I had a conversation with Ted when I must have been about 18 years of age. I was at Sussex University at the time studying Russian. And I asked him, I said, Ted, what are the main characteristics, the most important qualities of a revolutionary? And he didn't hesitate. He answered, a sense of proportion and a sense of humour. Now, I'll tell you, it was a surprising answer. I didn't expect. I expected other things like a solid knowledge of theory and courage and determination and all. No. A sense of proportion and a sense of humour. Now, the older I get, the more I understand the truth of those remarks. In order to really be a revolutionary, by the way, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. We're in this for the long haul. I've been doing this for all my life, and I will continue to do it as long as I can to serve the cause of the working class. But you see, first of all, you must have a sense of proportion. That's to say, you must understand what is possible and what is not possible. And you must stick doggedly to that. Sense must not exaggerate, but avoid exaggerations. It's a mistake. And a sense of humour, he had a tremendous sense of humour. It's like he'd always be cracking jokes and laughing and so on and so forth. And of course, he was an inveterate optimist. I'll tell you one funny story. Years ago, I went to Dublin, actually, on a political mission, and I met a man called Matt Merrigan. He must be dead now. He was not a young man at the time. And I think he'd been a member of the RCP, or if not, he was close to it. Anyway, he was now a very important leader of an important union. I think it was the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, I asked to speak to him, and he invited me into his office. Nice big office. And in the course of the conversation, he said to me, excuse the accent, he said, "Do you know Ted Grant?" I said, "Yes, I know Ted." "Oh," he said, "tell me," he says, "is he still optimistic?" I said, "Yes, he is optimistic." He said, "Let's face it," he said, "Ted Grant would be optimistic if he was falling off a cliff." Which, by the way, is probably true. Tremendous optimism. And he also, to be honest about it, he was also a bit of an eccentric. He was probably one of the last remainings of a dying species of English eccentrics. Although he was South African, he was very English also. Had many eccentricities, One of the things of course, he was very healthy in his lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, he would every day rigorously do exercise. So strong exercises, and he insisted on doing exercises. He told me, "You must exercise before you go to bed at night. You exercise till you're very tired, then you collapse and you have a good night's sleep." Which I must say is advice I never followed, but there you are. But he did a lot of exercise, and very healthy eater. He used to eat a lot. It's true, he was very fond of cakes, inordinately fond of sweet things. He didn't drink, by the way. He didn't smoke and he didn't drink, hardly at all. Until the end of his life, when he read somewhere that a glass of red wine occasionally is good for your health. So he had an occasional glass of red wine. Otherwise, he wouldn't bother. But he wasn't a vegetarian, but he ate a lot of fruit, particularly bananas. For breakfast, he'd turn up at the centre, I remember this, and he'd have a big bag full of fruit. And he would wash everything. He'd wash, then he'd peel it. He'd wash it first.
Wash the bananas before peeling them.
Wash everything, the bananas, the oranges, everything. He'd wash everything. Then he'd peel them, and then he'd eat them, It's astonishing. And he'd have this performance every day. He'd come into the office, and he'd apologise for being late. He was always late. And he'd have his Financial Times, and he'd have his breakfast, and he'd read the Financial Times, and that'd be it. You couldn't get him to discuss anything unless he got this routine sorted out. But I remember on one occasion, he turned up, but he used to go to the Labour Party conference assiduously. Of course, all the bureaucrats knew him, and of course he wasn't very popular. And he wasn't the best dressed person. I mean, you get these bureaucrats, they turn up with their posh suits and ties, staying at a posh hotel, and there's one morning they go down to the shower, to the bathroom, the toilets and so on. And there's this shabby old gentleman with a shabby old coat, standing over the sink, water everywhere, swamped, cleaning his bananas at Labour Party conference. Because the bureaucrats come and say, that's 10 grand.
A routine is a routine.
Oh no, nobody could stop him. But there you are. But anyway, he had a good sense of humour. He'd always have a good laugh. And also he was a very humane person. He'd never pass a beggar in the street without giving money, just a couple of coins. Never. And also he'd made a point of thanking the driver on the bus. Thank you, driver. You like this? And he would talk to kids, all the time. And in that sense, a very, very humane person indeed. And you never heard him swear, use bad language. And you never heard him nasty about anything. The one time I heard him there's two exceptions to this. There's two exceptions, or maybe three or four. There we are. No, but two of them are minor things. He used to refer to Jerry Healy as old baldy, and then subsequently referred to Taff also as old baldy. But there we are. That was the worst he said about them. But there was two exceptions, and that was Margaret Thatcher. We refer to as that bitch.
Very good.
And not politically correct, but then
No.
Ted Grant can be accused of many things, but never of being politically correct.
We will not be censoring that. Leave that in its entirety.
No, leave it in. I mean, but Ted was never politically correct. That bitch, he'd say. And, oh yes, Tony Blair, he described him as odious.
Quite kind, I think.
Odious.
Frankly.
I'd say, use some other expressions, but I can't remember. But otherwise, no, he was quite... and he'd talk about the political leaders of Britain and the world leaders as if he knew them personally, Actually, he studied them so much, he'd read the newspapers so closely. The Financial Times he'd read from cover to cover. And yes, with that you do develop a kind of feeling about people as individuals, which he had. So for Ted Grant, politics was nothing abstract about politics. It was very real, very palpable, very concrete. So there we are, and therefore, of course, also he attached enormous importance to the youth. He was very loyal to those old commies that had been with him for many years. He was loyal to them, very loyal to them. So sometimes one would think too loyal. But in any case, the youth, at the end of every conference, you'd never see him sitting with the old people. He was a bit dismissive of old people in general. Something which I also understand at my time of life. He would always be sitting with the youth, talking to them. And you see him at the end of a young socialist conference, he'd be sitting there, surrounded by youngsters, and he'd be speaking about what? I'll tell you, cosmology, the universe, why the Big Bang Theory was wrong. Another thing he used to read regularly was the New Scientist. It's gone to the dogs now. But it used to be a decent magazine years ago.
Yeah.
And he was well up on science, and which he approached from a dialectical point of view. And he used to be talking about science and this, that, and the other. And I've often had discussions with him about that, with very interesting theories that he put forward. So he was a man of a broad education. Also, he was very educated man. He liked classical music, not so much as myself, but he did like classical, mainly Beethoven, I think. But he read widely. He was very well read. Communists should note that, I sometimes think our communists are a bit too narrow. Ted Grant was not narrow, he was very broad-minded. Well read. He knew Shakespeare back to front, inside out, and upside down. He knew all Shakespeare's works. And Charles Dickens, he knew Dickens also. And his favourite writer then, he had two favourites. One was Jack London, which he thought he was a genius. Well, I think he's a very good writer. I think maybe Ted exaggerated. Certainly if you read something like, not just The Iron Heel, which everybody knows that, which is remarkable, but things like How to Light a Fire. Have you ever read that?
I've not.
You should do.
See, I'm narrow as well.
How to Light a Fire. It's about the chap up in the Arctic Circle prospecting for gold, as Jack London did at one time in his life. And he gets into trouble because it's very cold, 70 below zero, and he gets his feet wet, and then he's desperate. He must light a fire or he will die. And the struggle he gets to is an exorbitant. It's just a short story, How to Light a Fire. I won't tell you how it ends. And then there's another thing, which is a remarkable thing, which Ted used to quote. The Scarlet Plague, have you read that?
I haven't, but I remember you talking to me about it when we were watching that film Threads.
That's the point. It's a remarkable thing. At the time, of course, there was a lot of panic, hysteria, fear about nuclear war. And, of course, this was important. But, of course, you get some idiots in the so-called Fourth International. One Argentinian so-called Trotskyist called Posadas, a real fruit and nutcase, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, I wouldn't say much about Posadas.
It's quite popular amongst people telling jokes online these days.
Well, he was quite mad. I mean, one of his theories was he was pro-China. In the Sino-Soviet dispute, he was pro-Chinese. We were neutral. We didn't support either side, of course. He was pro-Chinese, unconditionally pro-Chinese. And he was in favour of nuclear war. He said, what's this fuss about nuclear? No, there should be a nuclear war, because in the end we would win. All right, humanity would be destroyed, but we build socialism, communism, build communism on the ashes.
The irradiated ashes.
That's right. And Ted said, no. Under those circumstances, I think it was Jimmy Dean actually said, under those circumstances, we'd have a transitional slogan, forward to barbarism.
Yeah.
But Ted said, well, Jack London said what would happen in this thing, the Scarlet Plague, long before nuclear weapons were ever thought of. But it envisages a future society in which medicine has conquered all diseases, all the contagious diseases. We've got a solution for them. But suddenly, in this model society, when everything is solved, apparently, a new virus appears for which there's no protection, called the Scarlet Plague. And it wipes out almost the entire population. That's as if there was a nuclear war. And what he then describes is that, of course, normally you'd have the scientists who would come back and invent everything. But this wasn't the case. There was a professor that survived in this novel, and he tried to explain to the children about science, and they loved it, but they thought they were he thought he was telling them fairy stories. Tell us fairy stories. These little barbarians could hardly speak English because the language had deteriorated, and science was lost. He was burying the books underground for future, in case someone should be able to read them. But Ted said that's what would happen in the event of a nuclear war, not what these other idiots say. Anyway, he had many very interesting stories. Well, the other novelist which he loved was Galsworthy. Very fine. I see he's got his series on the TV again, the Foresaw saga. Well, that's a remarkable one. I recommend anyone to read that. He was very progressive. In fact, he was a socialist. He was very, very left-wing. And Ted made a remarkable judgment about his work. He said of Galsworthy, he showed the bourgeois as they really are, and they never forgave him. And it's true, if you read the Foresaw, it's true. Anyway, there are many other things I could say about Ted, but it would take too long. Just to say that, as I say, he was a remarkable man that left an indelible impression on many people's lives, my own life in particular. I think it's fair to say that I was probably closer to Ted Grant than anyone else. His sister said that to me. He had an old sister in Paris, Ray, charming lady, but she was about 90 years of age when she died. Charming lady. But there we are. But she actually said, oh, you know my brother better than I do. He was a man that was worth knowing.
Well, what more can we say other than the real legacy of Ted Grant is, of course, on the one hand, the international that inherits his mantle, but also his ideas, which are thankfully collected. And we are just about to release the next volume, the third volume of his collected works, as I mentioned. And if you really want to get to know Ted Grant, I would first of all recommend reading Alan's biography, The Permanent Revolutionary, which I will link in the description. But to really know Ted Grant, you should read his contributions to Marxist theory, to Marxist analysis. Just preparing for this podcast, it was such a treat to be able to go back over his work in detail, because there are so many lessons, and you really get a sense of a man who truly conquered the ideas of Marxism. So I suppose if Ted leaves any sort of lesson or legacy to the revolutionaries of today, it's that red thread you were talking about, the emphasis on theory, the emphasis on understanding Marxist ideas.
Yes.
Well, Alan, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for telling us all about Ted and your memories of Ted and the lessons that you've learned from him and the lessons that he continues to teach us through his work.
It was a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to have these important memories revived.
All right, that's it from us this week. I'll see you next week for a new episode of the Spectre of Communism podcast.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communist.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.